The measure of a person is not found in the space they fill, but in the will they possess when the world tries to prove they have no place at all. The wagon wheels cut through the deep dust of Dust Devil Gorge, a town that seemed baked into the very rock of the canyon. Elspeth Vance, known to all as Elsie, sat tall on the wagon seat, her slight frame a stark contrast to the vast, unforgiving landscape. Her worn cotton dress was the color of the dirt, and the wide brim of her hat hid a gaze filled with a resolve that far outmatched her size. She pulled the mules to a halt before a weathered sign that read, Hobbs Mercantile, the letters faded by the relentless sun. The silence of the town was heavy, broken only by the creak of her wagon and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. She took a breath, the air thick with heat and judgment. Inside the mercantile the air was cooler, smelling of dried goods, leather and chewing tobacco. The low murmur of conversation ceased as Elsie entered. Mr. Hobbs, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, peered at her over his spectacles. "Well now, what can I do for you, little lady?" His voice was coated in false politeness. Elsie placed her list on the counter. Seed corn, a shovel head, flour, salt. Men leaning against barrels exchanged smirking glances. As Hobbs weighed the flour, he chuckled. Quite an ambition for one so delicate. The words hung in the air, a quiet mockery she had grown accustomed to, yet it never stung any less. She paid him without a word, her chin held high. The sun was a physical blow as she stepped back onto the main street. Her path was suddenly blocked. Jebediah Harding, his polished boots a defiant gleam against the dust, stood before her. He was the son of the valley's wealthiest rancher, a man whose arrogance was his birthright. "I remember you," he drawled, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "From the trail. My father said you were just another mouth to feed." He gestured dismissively at the sack of seeds in her arms. With a sudden, deliberate motion, he knocked the sack from her grasp. It burst upon the ground, spilling her hopes into the thick, red dust. "Looks like your luck has not changed," he sneered. Humiliation burned in Elsie's cheeks. Before she could react, a shadow fell over them. From the deep shade of the saloon porch, a figure emerged. He was a tall Arapaho warrior, his face stoic, carved by wind and time. He moved with a silence that commanded attention. Without a glance at Harding, he knelt. With steady hands, he scooped the precious seeds back into the torn sack. As he stood to hand it to her, his dark eyes noticed something glinting near her boot. It was her mother's silver locket, fallen from her pocket. He picked it up and placed it gently in her palm. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting moment. Then, as silently as he appeared, he was gone. The wind on her claim was a constant thief, stealing warmth from her skin and whispers of doubt into her ear. Elsie's shelter, a patchwork of canvas and scavenged boards, offered little comfort against the vast loneliness of the plains. Each swing of the mattock into the stony soil was a battle. Her hands, though calloused, were raw and aching. She was planting a fence more than building one, a line drawn against the wilderness and her own despair. The memory of her mother's words, a gentle melody from a lifelong past, felt like a story told about someone else, in some other, kinder world. The stubborn earth beneath her feet was her only reality now. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a rider approached. He was an older man on a steady gray horse. He dismounted, his movements weary but deliberate. It was Dr. Alistair Finch, the town's physician. His eyes, surrounded by a web of fine lines, seemed to take in her entire struggle in a single glance. He looked at the crooked fence posts, the small patch of turned earth, and the determined set of her jaw. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle. "This land rewards the stubborn, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly comfort. "Not the large." He offered her the water, a simple gesture that felt like a profound act of grace. That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. A violent onslaught of thunder and rain. The wind clawed at her lean-to, and cold water dripped onto her face, each drop a reminder of her vulnerability. She huddled under her thin blanket, the sound of the tempest a roaring beast outside her fragile walls. She felt impossibly small, a forgotten speck in the immense, raging darkness of the frontier. Sleep was a distant shore she could not reach. She could only endure, listening to the fury of the world as it tried to wash her and her foolish dreams away for good, her heart pounding with every crash of thunder. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. Elsie stepped out into the crisp, cool air. There, on the flat stone that served as her doorstep, sat a small object. It was a kestrel, carved from a piece of sun-bleached wood with incredible skill, its wings slightly flared as if ready for flight. In its tiny talons it clutched a single smooth pebble. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. Burned into the wooden base was a single word, a command and a promise that resonated deep in her soul. Fight. She looked toward the distant ridges, her heart suddenly lighter. The next storm was a devil, a maelstrom of wind and driving rain that seemed personally intent on her destruction. The canvas of her lean-to tore with a sound like a scream. A gust of wind slammed a loose board against her, sending her tumbling into the cold, slick mud. Dazed and gasping, she lay there, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Defeat was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had fought, but the land was winning. The fight was over. She closed her eyes, ready to let the cold seep into her bones and end the struggle. She had nothing left to give. The world could have what remained of her. A presence made her open her eyes. He stood over her, a figure made of rain and shadow. It was the Arapaho warrior. He seemed to have materialized from the storm itself, his broad shoulders shrugging off the deluge as if it were a mere nuisance. Without a word, he moved past her. He grabbed the flapping canvas, his strength immense. With rope and salvaged wood, he began to anchor her ruined shelter, his movements efficient and powerful. He did not fight the storm. He worked with it, redirecting its force, turning its chaos into a new, stronger order. Elsie watched, mesmerized by his silent competence. When the shelter was secure, he finally turned to her. He gestured toward the small wooden kestrel she had placed on a crate inside. "The kestrel is small," he said, his voice deep and calm, like stones at the bottom of a river. "But its heart is a hunter's heart." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see past the mud and the despair. "I am called Black Hawk." Elsie struggled to her feet, mud clinging to her dress. "My name is Elsie." He gave a slow, single nod of acknowledgement. A silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of the fight within her that he had seen from the very beginning. Before he left, his gaze swept across the edge of her claim. He pointed a long finger toward the ground near a cluster of rocks. "Shod horses," he said. They stood there a long time, watched. Elsie peered into the twilight, seeing nothing but the familiar landscape. But he saw more. He saw the unseen threat, the danger that did not announce itself with thunder. "Be careful," he warned, his voice low. "Not all shadows come from the clouds." And then he was gone, melting back into the gray curtain of rain, leaving her with a new and more chilling fear than any storm could bring. Black Hawk began to appear more often, his arrivals as quiet and natural as the sunrise. They worked together on the fence, a silent rhythm developing between them. He would set a post with 3 powerful blows of a mallet. She would stretch the wire, her small hands surprisingly strong. He taught her things the land knew. How to find water by watching the willows. How to read the stories left in the dust by the passing of a coyote or a deer. He showed her which roots were good for medicine and which berries were sweet. A language of shared tasks and quiet glances grew between them, more meaningful than any spoken words. During a rest in the shade of a lone cottonwood, he spoke of his past. He told her of the white school, far to the south, a place designed to erase his identity. "They cut my hair," he said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "They gave me a number, and told me my tongue was heathen." He spoke of the cold, the hunger, and the crushing loneliness. Elsie listened, her heart aching for the boy he had been. She felt a profound connection to his story of being stripped of his name and worth. For she too had been judged and found wanting by the world for things she could not change. Emboldened by his trust, Elsie shared her own story. She spoke of being an orphan, passed from one reluctant family to another, always Elsie the little, a burden to be fed and clothed until she was old enough to be useful. She told him of her decision to claim her own piece of the world, no matter how small or barren. She pulled out her mother's silver locket, the one thing that was truly hers. "It is all I have of her," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had never shown it to another soul, but with him, it felt safe. It felt right. Black Hawk took the locket, his large, calloused fingers handling it with reverence. He turned it over and over, his sharp eyes studying its surface. Then he pointed to the back. "Look," he said softly. With the tip of his knife, he traced an etching so faint it was nearly invisible. It was a tiny kestrel, soaring high. Elsie gasped, her eyes wide with wonder. She had owned the locket her entire life and had never seen it. "A bird that sees far," Black Hawk murmured, his gaze meeting hers, "and never gives up." In that moment, she knew he understood her in a way no one else ever had. One evening, as the last rays of sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Black Hawk gestured to her lean-to. "The winter wind will scatter this like leaves," he stated simply. His gaze was direct, leaving no room for argument. "You need a home, walls of log, a roof to hold back the snow. I will help you build it." The offer was so vast, so unexpected, that Elsie was left speechless. A home, a real home. It was a dream she had not dared to form, a hope too fragile to be exposed to the harsh light of day. But he spoke of it as if it were a simple, achievable fact. Elsie hesitated, her mind filled with the scornful faces in town, the whispers, the judgment. "People will talk," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Black Hawk's expression did not change. "Let them talk," he replied, his voice firm. "Their words will not keep you warm in a blizzard." He turned his gaze to the distant mountains where the first hint of autumn was touching the aspens with gold. "The cold is coming. We must work." His certainty was a rock she could cling to in a sea of doubt. It was not a question of if, but when. Meanwhile, Jebediah Harding's interest in her land grew more sinister. It was not just about pride anymore. He sent 2 of his hired men, the brutish Barlow brothers, to deliver a message. They rode onto her claim, their horses trampling the small vegetable garden she had painstakingly coaxed from the rocky soil. They did not speak to her, but their actions were clear. As a final warning, they left a dead rattlesnake coiled on the flat stone by her shelter's entrance, its lifeless eyes a promise of what was to come. The message was clear: leave or be removed. When Black Hawk arrived the next morning, he saw the trampled garden and the dead snake. His face, usually a mask of calm composure, hardened into granite. He said nothing, but a cold fire ignited in his dark eyes. He carefully removed the snake and dismantled the ruined remains of her garden, his movements precise and filled with a controlled fury. Elsie watched him, a knot of fear and anger tightening in her stomach. She understood then. Harding did not just want to drive her away. He wanted to break her spirit, to grind her down until nothing was left. "Yes," Elsie said, her voice clear and steady when Black Hawk looked at her. "We will build it." The decision settled in her heart, a solid foundation on which to build her future. They began the next day. He brought pine logs down from the high country, carrying them on his broad shoulders as if they were mere kindling. He taught her how to notch the logs so they locked together, creating walls that were strong and true. The work was hard, her muscles screaming in protest, but with every log they set, she felt a piece of her own broken spirit mending. The steady rhythm of their work, the thud of the axe, the scrape of the draw knife, became the new sound of her life. It was a language of creation, a partnership built in sweat and silence. She learned to anticipate his needs, handing him a tool before he asked. He, in turn, seemed to learn the limits of her strength, never pushing her beyond what she could bear, yet always encouraging her to try. In the shared effort of building a home, they were building something else between them, something quiet and strong, as solid as the log walls rising around them. One afternoon, Dr. Finch rode out to their building site. He brought a satchel of medical supplies and a basket of food from his wife, but his true purpose was a warning. While Black Hawk was down by the creek, the doctor spoke to Elsie in a low, urgent voice. "Harding is not just a rich bully, child," he said. "His father was a ruthless man. They say an old prospector vanished on this very piece of land, years ago. The Hardings have always believed he found a rich vein of silver here and died before he could work it." The doctor's words cast a dark shadow over the sunny afternoon. That night the shadows returned. The Barlow brothers, emboldened by the darkness, crept toward the growing cabin. They carried oil and torches, their intent clear. But Black Hawk was not at the creek. He had remained hidden in the rocks above the claim, his instincts warning him of danger. He watched them approach, his bow drawn. A single silent arrow flew through the night, striking the older Barlow in the shoulder. A cry of pain shattered the silence. The brothers, panicked and terrified of the unseen archer, fled into the darkness, leaving their torches behind. The cabin was safe, for now. The next morning, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of the law. Sheriff Brody, a man with a weary face and a tarnished badge, rode up to the half-finished cabin. Beside him, seething with rage, was Jebediah Harding. Trailing behind them was the wounded Barlow brother, his arm in a crude sling. "Miss Vance," the sheriff began, his voice tired. "Mr. Harding here claims this man," he nodded toward Black Hawk, who stood silently by the woodpile, "attacked his employee without cause last night." His gaze was heavy, weighing the situation. "That is a lie," Elsie said, stepping forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was firm. "They came in the night. They were going to burn my home." Harding let out a harsh laugh. "Her home? Sheriff, this savage is just using her to get at her land. Who are you going to believe? A respectable citizen, or this heathen and a half-pint woman he has bewitched?" The air crackled with tension. Sheriff Brody looked from Harding's furious face to Elsie's defiant one, his expression unreadable. He had seen too much greed and violence to take any man's word at face value. It was then that Black Hawk spoke, his voice calm and level, cutting through Harding's tirade. "He lies," he said, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "Harding does not want this land for pasture. He wants it for what is beneath." He walked to a rock outcropping near the cabin's foundation and pointed. "Old marks. From a pick. A white man's tool." He then gestured to the hills. "His father killed a prospector for this land but never found the silver lode. Now he thinks she has." Every word was a stone dropped into a silent pool, the ripples spreading outwards. Jebediah Harding's face went pale, his bluster vanishing in an instant. Sheriff Brody stared at the faint marks on the rock, then at Harding's guilty expression. The sheriff was an old hand, and he knew the scent of truth when he smelled it, just as he knew the stink of a long-buried crime. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. He could not prove the old murder, but he could see the greed and violence of the present moment. "Harding," he said, his voice now cold as iron, "get off this claim, and do not come back." He turned his horse, leaving Harding to stare after him, his face a mask of thwarted fury. The accusations against Black Hawk dissolved like smoke in the wind. Sheriff Brody's public dismissal of Harding's claims sent a clear message. The story of the old prospector and the hidden silver spread through Dust Devil Gorge like wildfire, and with it the truth of Harding's relentless persecution of Elsie. The tide of public opinion, once a current of ridicule, began to turn. People looked at Elsie differently now. They saw not a peculiar little woman, but a homesteader of immense courage, who had stood her ground against the most powerful man in the valley. Help began to arrive, not as an organized effort, but in small, quiet acts of individual conscience. The blacksmith, a burly man who had once smirked at her, arrived one morning with a set of heavy iron hinges for her door, forged with his own hands. "A proper house needs a strong door," he mumbled, refusing payment. Dr. Finch's wife brought a thick, hand-stitched quilt and a basket filled with bread, cheese, and dried apples, her smile a silent apology for the town's earlier cruelty. These were not gifts of charity, but offerings of respect. Even Mr. Hobbs, the mercantile owner, made a gesture of peace. He left a sack of fine coffee beans on her doorstep before the sun was up, a silent admission of his misjudgment. With the community's help, the house was finished. The roof was laid, the windows set, and a sturdy door hung on the blacksmith's hinges. It stood strong and proud against the skyline, a testament not only to her own resilience, but to the slow, grudging birth of a community's conscience. It was more than a shelter. It was a symbol. But Harding was not a man to accept defeat. His public humiliation had curdled into a dark, obsessive hatred. He watched from the ridges, his heart a cold knot of resentment. He had lost the respect of the town, and he had been denied the silver he saw as his birthright. All because of one small woman, and the Arapaho who protected her. He gathered the men still loyal to him, those who lived on his payroll and in his shadow. He would not be denied. If he could not have the land, he would see it turn to ash, and them with it. The night was moonless, a black velvet cloth draped over the valley. Harding and his men crept toward the cabin, their boots silent in the soft dust. They moved like predators, their hearts filled with malice. Harding carried a can of kerosene, his face illuminated by a grim smile in the brief flare of a match. This time, there would be no warnings, no mistakes. He would burn the house to the ground and ensure no one came out alive. The first shot was meant not as a warning, but as an announcement of the end. It shattered the new glass of the window, the sound of vicious crack in the night silence. Inside, Elsie did not scream. Black Hawk had taught her well. She grabbed the rifle he had insisted she learn to use, her hands steady despite the terror that seized her. Black Hawk was already moving, a phantom in the dark confines of the cabin. He handed her a pouch of cartridges. "Stay away from the window. Fire when they show themselves," he commanded in a low voice. He moved to the opposite side of the room, his bow in hand, the string already drawn. The siege had begun. They were trapped, but they were not helpless. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets tore through the log walls, splintering the wood. Elsie, her fear transmuted into a cold focus, fired back, aiming at the muzzle flashes that lit up the darkness. Outside, Black Hawk moved with lethal grace. He was not in the cabin, but outside, a ghost in the rocks. His arrows flew from the darkness, silent and deadly. One of Harding's men cried out and fell. The attackers, expecting a cowering woman and a single target, were now caught in a deadly crossfire, unsure where the true threat lay. But the attackers had not counted on Sheriff Brody. The lawman's distrust of Harding had not abated. He had sent a deputy to keep a discreet watch on the rancher's movements. When the deputy saw Harding and his men ride out armed, he raced to warn the sheriff. They arrived as the gunfight raged, their arrival announced by Brody's booming shout, "In the name of the law, drop your arms!" Caught between the defenders in the cabin and the lawmen at their backs, the remaining attackers threw down their guns. The battle was over. In the sudden, ringing silence, Harding stood defeated, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. Dawn broke over a landscape scarred by violence but ultimately unbroken. Elsie and Black Hawk stood on the porch of their cabin. The air smelled of gunpowder and pine. Bullet holes pocked the walls, and the front window was a gaping hole, but the house stood. The threat was gone. Sheriff Brody had taken Harding and his surviving men into custody. Their future was a cell and a judge's sentence. The land, and the secrets it held, now truly belonged to Elsie. But she knew the real treasure was not the silver buried in the rock, but the peace they had fought for. The townspeople came later that day, not with gifts, but with hammers and saws and quiet determination. They replaced the broken window, patched the bullet holes in the walls, and helped clear the debris from the gunfight. It was a communal act of healing, a final rejection of Harding's brand of violence and a full embrace of Elsie as one of their own. Dr. Finch tended to a shallow graze on Black Hawk's arm, his touch gentle. "You two have earned your peace," he said, his eyes filled with a deep paternal respect. That evening, as the first stars pricked the deep purple of the sky, Black Hawk sat with Elsie on the porch steps. The world was quiet again, the only sounds the chirp of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. He reached into a pouch at his belt and took out her silver locket. He had held it for safekeeping during the fight. Now, he opened his other hand. In it lay a small, perfectly polished piece of turquoise, the color of a mountain lake. It was the stone he had shown her once, found high in the mountains. He carefully fastened the small stone to the locket's chain, where it rested beside the silver kestrel. "Two worlds," he said, his voice a low murmur. "One path." He placed the chain around her neck. The cool metal was a comfort against her skin. They needed no preacher, no ceremony. Their vows had been spoken in the shared labor of building, in the terror of the fight, and in the quiet respect that had grown between them. Elsie looked up at him, her small form leaning against his strength, and knew she was no longer small at all. She was home.